Welcome, everybody, to this event. We're here to discuss independence in the city, creating accessible spaces. Before we get going, I just wanted to reconfirm that we are recording, as you just heard. My name is Mary Bowman, and I'm a partner in the landscape design practice of Gustafson Porter and Bowman. I also have the pleasure of being a member of the Equilibrium Network Steering Group, and together with an amazing group of 12 other senior women from across the industry, have enjoyed helping to develop EQN into what it is today. We're an international multidisciplinary network, which now has around 800 members, both men and women, including architects, engineers, landscape architects, contractors, surveyors, policymakers, and urbanists, as well as those working in client organizations, academia, and institutes. Our purpose has developed over the years. Originally, we had two objectives. One, addressing the attrition rate of women working within the industry, and two, increasing the number of women at the top of organizations that create and shape the built environment. But more recently, we've redefined our aim with a broader remit to enable women to have equal influence in the design and delivery of the built environment. Our two initial objectives remain as pertinent as ever, but to help achieve this broader aim, we've added three more objectives: creating an international network, influencing the industry to deliver diversity and inclusion with a particular emphasis on women, and promoting the needs, preferences, and aspirations of women in the design of our built environment. In support of our objectives, we undertake research, develop strategic advice, and run occasional events, of which this is one. We're also delighted to have been part of a successful consortium of 26 different entities from across Europe, including 5 European cities: Aarhus, Bucharest, Castellón, Orvieto, and Potsdam, which secured funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 for an amazing project called Diversity. This is an ambitious project with a focus on gender that aims to harness the power of diversity and inclusion for climate-neutral cities, shifting the urban paradigm from valuing human diversity as a resource that can help develop new urban services and models for culturally driven green cities. The Equilibrium Network was strongly involved in helping to define Diversity's strategic aims, and as the project has become a reality, we're ensuring that women's voices are heard in the planning, delivery, and long-term legacy of all the diversity initiatives. So to today's conversation about creating accessible urban spaces. I'll be keeping track of time, so if anybody goes over, I'll be letting you know. I'm very pleased to welcome Jane Simpson, who will introduce our panel of speakers. Jane is a chartered architect and registered access consultant of the National Register of Access Consultants and director of her own company. She has over 30 years' experience in inclusion, providing advice on a broad range of issues, often clarifying complex aspects of equality legislation. Jane has been involved in access-related organizations for many years, including the RIBA, DPTAC, DFE, Design Council, Sport England, the BSI, NRAC, and EHRC. Hope you get all those acronyms. In addition, extensive links with many governmental departments and professional organizations, contributing to the development of inclusive design practices and standards. Jane is a member of the Selwyn Goldsmith Award judging panel, contributing to the RIBA as a specialist practice advisor on access, representing them on the Inclusion Hub project. BSI B559 committee, is a member of the Architects for Change group and the International Union of Architects. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Mary. As mentioned, I am an architect and an access consultant, and I have been involved for over 30 years. I cut my teeth very early on in inclusion. What I think we all know is that inclusivity and equity in our built environment is essential. We're all individuals whose experiences are varied, as we all are. And once we leave our front door, we are impacted on by how designers might see the world or our world. Now, tonight we have 3 amazing speakers whose topics are as broad as their experience. Now, David is going to talk about the value of placing people at the heart of design, going beyond standards, challenging assumptions, and diversify perspectives. Now, Nick is going to explain how he works with neurodiverse people in the huge testing laboratory called Pearl. I'm sure that's short for something, but I'm not quite sure what. Enabling us to understand what we need to do to make the environment work. Now, Fiona will be talking about the Blue Badge Access Awards as an incentive for venues, places, and people to create seamless, innovative, and stylish accessibility. So for me, these sessions cover the who, how, and why. That is critical in ensuring we can all experience the environment together. Now, please do drop questions into the box. You can see it at the bottom of your screen. We're hoping for lots, and we'll try to leave enough time at the end to cover as many as we possibly can. We'll take questions right at the very end. Some might be answered directly in the box, but others we will talk about in the final session. However, if your question isn't answered, we will try to respond after the session, if that's okay with everybody. So firstly, let me introduce David. Okay, now I'm going to read this because obviously it's got quite a history, has David. We've known each other for quite a long while, actually. He's director of Burdis Access. He's a wheelchair user with 35 years inclusive design and engagement experience on public and private sector projects, from single buildings refurbishments to city centre regeneration, from the micro to the maximum. His projects range from he's done the Diane, Princess of Wales Memorial Fountain to Paris One. Other international projects have ranged from Central Park, New York, British Embassy projects in Rome and Mauritius, to Seattle's City Wayfinding Strategy. Specialising in Equality Act compliance and employability, he has carried out audits, mediation, strategy, expert reporting and staff engagement for UK government departments, including DWP, DEFRA, FCDO and HMRC. He sat on the steering panel for the REBA Enterprises Access Management Services Agreement and the Disability Confident Sounding Board to the Minister for Disabled People. I'm glad I'm reading this. David was presented with his, I could never have remembered it. David was presented with his England's Young Business Achiever Award by HMRC Prince Philip, now the King, for his influence on built environment accessibility, and as the current chair of the British Wheelchair Racing Association, which I've had a go at wheelchair rugby, and that was really good fun. Anyway, thank you, David, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. And I'm currently working on building a ramp to my garage, and I'm wearing 2 pairs of glasses. 43 years ago, I severed my spinal cord in a motorbike accident, and before I was discharged from hospital, they made me learn to walk on calipers and crutches, do wheelies, get down flights of stairs, believe it or not, backwards in my wheelchair hanging onto the handrail. Why, I hear you ask? Well, back in the day, the built environment was absolutely hopeless. I had to get carried into pubs and restaurants. There were no accessible toilets. I had to urinate in car parks and street drains, no drop curbs, so I had to bounce up and down them on my back wheels. So I can tell you, without a shadow of a doubt, that the advancement of disability rights legislation and access standards have made a huge difference, albeit slow. Most nations now have good high-level policy, but translating it into practice isn't nearly straightforward. I think you skipped a slide ahead there, actually. For example, I first spoke to John Major, the then Prime Minister, in 1994 about getting rid of the steps to number 10. And that me in 2014, 30 years later, having the same conversation with the then Minister for Disabled People. Next. That's it. So on a positive, though, I am finding that design professionals do now recognise that access standards are a good minimum reference point, but that one size doesn't fit all. Same as for shoes, really. So here we can see the 2 central images in the red boxes is that the UK building regulations minimum wheelchair accessible cubicle dimensions, 1.5 meters by 2.2. Next to that, just on the right, the British standard 180-degree turn for larger powered chairs. Now, strangely enough, that space is bigger than the actual toilet. So you can't actually make that turn without kicking the sink off the wall. Now, space standards are catching up with people. I can report that, which is really great, for example, size and reach. But where a lot of us can do a lot more is for children. Everyone is a child at some point. And here you can see a picture of me using my staff's child labour to advise a project, Centre for the Children's Book, on low-level sink height and equipment reach. And the children who used the site absolutely loved the Goldilocks and the Three Bears porridge bowl theme, so that the baby bears, as baby bears, they could wash their paws. Next. So getting it right doesn't happen by chance, but the good news is it is happening. More teams are finding out what works for people. And here, tactile models of a public transport exchange are presented to vision impaired people by my colleague David there, stretching over. He's a wheelchair using architect, and he made that model, whilst the landscape architect, standing, is present to learn, answer questions, but most importantly, come up with the design solutions. And what happened? We made a difference. We got results. On the left is a picture of my colleague Alan following tactile surface to the metro, that's the rail link station, despite the glaring sunshine, which would ordinarily bring him to a grinding halt. And there's Bob on the right-hand side, following a very narrow band of guidance, surface guidance, very confidently across a road surface in a shared space. Now, the image on the left is a 10-bar width path. Now, that's the government standard. And the one on the right is just 2 bars. Now, that was an adaptation that we made on site from that standard. Now, interesting, what I find is that anywhere in the world, what we find is that these type of users actually have the same requirements. So it's a common international language, if you like. And the reason I mention that is here on the bottom right, this is in Paris, we did some workshops, is that we got some fantastic results, not least the need for visually impaired people saying that they wanted surface guidance across road crossings to stop them wandering into the path of traffic. So do you remember Bob from the last slide? Same thinking, isn't it? So in the UK, our Department for Transport Guidance advocates 80 centimetre wide, 10-bar surface guidance at a 5mm profile. Now, many designers feel this is visually gross, and many users feel it's far too wide as well, especially wheelchair users, ambulant disabled people, and people wearing high heels, not least because there's no gap for them to get through. So in France, the government will allow you a 27 centimetre width and a lower profile, which is interesting. So inspired by that, we asked the UK, why 80 centimetres wide? Why no gaps? Well, you must stick to the standards. Okay, well, can I see your user testing and feedback? No. Why not? Oh, we don't have any. So as I say, so inspired by the French, we thought we'll do it our own way. Let's make the guidance paths narrow and let's put some gaps in it. So we did just that. And we did it with Gustafson, Porter and Bowman on a site for a client who had several disabled employees. Now the employers user forum wanted independent use for blind and visually impaired people, but with minimizing barriers for others. So Gustafson, Porter, Bowman designed it, the contractor built it, the staff users tested it, and everybody loved it. So we found that the 2-bar surface was no problem whatsoever, that the gaps were strategically placed at junctions and turning points, so no problem for mobility aid users. So wheelchair users could wheel along it because it was so thin, and when there was a turning point, they could cross it. The site was privately managed, but the local planning authority approved it. But what we haven't done yet is gone back to government with our findings to see if we can apply that to the public realm. So watch this space. We also developed and tested and installed some blister profiling. That's the profiling you get at crossing points, because one of the staff members had Morton's neuroma, a very painful foot condition, and she wanted to be able to cross the paving. So we did it again. We asked her what she'd need. She said she wanted a gap. We trialed and tested it with visually impaired people. We mocked it up on site. Mary's team designed it. We put it in. Everybody loved it, and it worked. So here we go. So what we're doing is we're actually developing and moving into and challenging standards, and we're getting better provision. So just summarising, 3 key aspects here is take inspiration from standards, but you can use them and develop them. There's a little grey picture here from the French standard at road crossings, which allows you to put a tactile map. We actually added a street name and some braille and put that back to the city of Paris, and we're waiting to see what they might do with that, which is very interesting. So use standards and get disabled professionals involved. So here's what happened when a vision impaired access consultant got hold of an initial sign concept on the left, which you couldn't make head and tail of. within 15 minutes came back with the designs on the right, connecting and infilling shapes for definition, humanizing the form, adding text for clarity, and keeping the client's double structural line in there for a visual client brand preservation. And get people with lived experience. That's people who actually know what they're talking about because they live it every day. Here's a guy with kyphosis testing some signage for a hospital during COVID. And he's saying it makes no sense to put a sign on the high up on a door. You may as well put it on the ceiling. It really hurts my neck. I can't do it. Whereas at 1200 millimeters above the floor level, this was perfect. And he actually advised it could be quite nice actually to have them on the floor. Guess what? The sign that the hospital's got signs on its floors now. So what I'm saying is we really need to be doing is, as we move forward, challenge and think about and develop standards. Don't just rely on our own bias, which you can see people have been doing here. It's always great to get an enthusiastic design team leader working with you. Diversify your perspectives. Let me explain using the World War II bomber bullet hole principle. During the Second World War, many bombers were shot down. During aerial fights, surviving crews returned home with bullet holes all over their planes, wingtips, fuselage, tail. Bomber Command was all set to armor up these areas to protect them when Abraham Vold, a Hungarian Jewish statistician experienced in analysing survivor data, said, "You're completely wrong." He realised the British were only analysing data from bombers that survived and returned. Those that were shot down weren't looked at, weren't part of the sample. So guess where their bullet holes were? Yes, in the cockpit and in the engine. So you see how easy it is to get an ineffective solution, design a product if our data or perspectives are limited, but how easy it is to get it right when we get that perspective, i.e. from those visually impaired people. So for inclusive design, think outside the box, always challenge assumptions, go beyond standards, diversify our perspectives, don't rely on our own bias. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I've got some really interesting notes, and I think I've mentioned it before. I need some of your research.
Thank you.
Research is really, really important. I'd just like now to introduce you to Nick. Now, Nick Tyler is at the Chadwick Professor of Civil Engineering at UCL and Director of the UCL Centre for Transport Studies. Now, using his musical background, I love musicians, Nick combines highly diverse fields in his research and teaching, from science and engineering through to performing arts and policy. To do this, he's created what was £50 million worth of massive, multi-scale, multi-sensory, person-environment activated, that's where the pearl comes from, person-environment activity research laboratory to allow him and his team to study the interactions of environments, people, and their activities at life scale to complex urban environments and vehicles. Really, the laboratory is a sort of large hadron collider for studying human beings. This approach is a new way of examining how people interact with the environment using a combination of neuroscience, psychology, physiology, engineering, and creative arts to inform the synthesis of these results to create new ways of designing safe, accessible, aesthetic, effective, and energy beneficial environments that work for both people and the planet. Nick's approach is to work with capabilities, what people can do, rather than what they can't. And this has meant a holistic view of the range of capabilities encountered in the population and how people really encounter the environments they live in. I think, as I mentioned, we're all completely different, so therefore we need to look at how people live in these environments. Now, Nick is a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, Institute of Civil Engineers, the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, and the Royal Society of Arts. And he was appointed a CBE in 2011 and awarded the CIHT, which I think is the Chartered, I can't remember now, Institute of Highways and Transportation, I think, Institutional Award in 2022. And I'll pass you on to Nick.
Hi, everybody. Gosh, so I'm going to talk to you very quickly about Pearl and how we use it in this particular case, in particular about neurodiversity, which is becoming an increasingly important area of concern that's been ignored a lot over too many years and is now becoming more salient for more people, and therefore we've been having to look at that, and it's difficult to look at in the real world because the real world is very complicated. So that's why we have Perl, because we can then create the world, control the environment, and play with it. So what is it? So it is basically a place, if you go to the next slide, this is a place where we can build worlds inside. When the architects asked me what I was going to put in this building, I said, the world. And that got them a bit sort of thinking. But the idea is that we build worlds that at the scale that people encounter them. We put real buses in there, and real bus stops, and real cars and real roads and things like that inside, but we can then control the environment so we can understand how people are interacting with them, what they find difficult, what they find easy, and so on, so that we can then understand how we should be designing these environments to make it better for everybody. So the next slide. So Perl is the only laboratory in the university that actually has a vision. And our vision is not just to sort of fix the minutiae. Our vision actually is to change the world. We want to make it much better for everybody. We want people to feel safe. We want them to be healthy. We want it to work in a mutually beneficial way, and be equitable. And that means that environment has to be able to accommodate everybody. And that becomes important because if you go to the next slide, our approach is, as Jane said, that is to look at capabilities and to look at how we can actually use people's capabilities to enable them to have ownership of what they can do and to be able to do that without the environment getting in the way. And so that means that we take a rather different view. And neurodiversity is kind of a good example of that. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that people often say about neurodiversity is there is a spectrum. And I hate the term spectrum because it kind of implies that you're sort of somewhere on one end or the other of some very narrow, defined sense of whatever normal is or typical or something like that. And really the world is not like that. We are all neurodiverse. We all have things we find difficult. We all have things that we find challenging that other people don't understand why we find challenging. Everybody has something in their range physically and cognitively about that. What we actually need to do is to be able to accommodate the whole person and to understand how that actually all works together with different people having different sets of challenges, and how do we actually meet all of those sets of challenges becomes an issue. So that means that we have to say, instead of spectrum, let's talk about a kind of ecosystem, everything. How do they all interact with each other? Talk about those capabilities as kind of, there's a whole range of how easy it is for somebody to see, or how easy it is for somebody to be distracted by clashing colors. How do we actually, in many cases, some of those competences are going to be defined by culture. In some cultures, there is no pressure on people to read things. In other cultures, there's a distinct pressure to read things. And so what becomes important depends on where we are and where we're coming from and what we're doing and so on. We then also have the changing of capabilities over time and place. So the fact that somebody, David had a wonderful example of somebody having a difficulty with glaring sunshine, for example. So at some parts of the day, possibly even times of year, we would have, that person might have a real problem with glare, and other times they wouldn't. So we need to make sure that we accommodate that difficulty with glare, even though it's only for a short time in the year. We don't just sort of say, oh, well, that's only 10 minutes. I had this big argument with Network Rail about this. Actually, we have to make sure that's accommodated for when it does happen. We need to realize, and neurodiversity is an interesting one because the brain actually accommodates itself to the environment, and it's actually very good at doing that. And so it meets an environment, it then predicts what you need to do in order to accommodate that environment. If you have a difficulty with doing that, if the brain doesn't quite deal with that environment, then we have to look at whether we can change that environment. So there's this mix of things that we have to do to be able to get how we understand how the brain responds to the environment, how we make the brain change so that that response is something which the person feels comfortable with. Then we can then think through the environment and how we're going to change that, and how that then comes round back into that ecosystem that we're changing. So how does it all work and how does it all continue? But the key, if you go to the next one, the key is really how that all comes together between those, how we get the brain adapting and how we adapt the environment to match, and so on, how we can work with that. Here's some examples inside that laboratory. Recently, we did some work with Guide Dogs for the Blind, looking at what's called floating island bus stops and bus border bypass bus stops, which is basically, these are bus stops that accommodate cycle lanes. And these are very, very challenging for, in particular, for visually impaired people, but also neurodiverse people, people with dementia, people in wheelchairs, and so on. And we're looking at these two bus lanes that you see, two bus stops you see there, are actually designed according to the guidance that is currently there. I would argue one could be adapted so that it might work. The other one, I cannot see any way that it would work. But what we now have is the scientific evidence that can back up those things, so we can start to know a bit better what we're talking about when we go and start saying, giving out the answers to this when we finally analysed everything in a couple of months' time. On the right-hand side, you see a pedestrian crossing. One of the dilemmas with pedestrian crossings for a lot of people is that as a pedestrian, the pedestrian crossings are actually well lit because there's a regulation that says they need to be, but actually they feel very visible, but actually they're invisible because of the way the eye works. And so what we're trying to do is to work out how should we be lighting a pedestrian crossing so that the pedestrian feels suitably safe and cautious, and the driver of a car feels suitably able to see and work with the pedestrian crossing the road at a distance that is safe for them to be able to travel with. And we can do that kind of work with cars and so on in the laboratory where it's safe and we can understand what people are doing. If we go to the next one, we also looked at electric scooters. We were asked to make a sound for electric scooters so that we could start to bring those electric scooters into a realm. Is it possible to make people less shocked and surprised by their sudden appearance? So we've been doing that. We've also been working on the accessibility of trains. This is a mock-up we did a little while ago for the new Piccadilly line trains, where we were looking at how difficult it was to get on and off trains, what people did when they were getting on, what should the design of the vestibules be like, and the platform train interface, and all of those sorts of things. That design work is now being tested in Germany, and those trains are going to be coming into service later this year, early next year. So that's putting people right at the beginning of the design process as to how we can actually start to make sure that our transport system actually works with all ranges of people. If we go to the next one, this is some work we did in Pearl. The picture on the left is we built a park inside the laboratory complete with its live trees and things. And this was for work for the Department of Psychiatry, where we were looking at how autistic children were dealing with the conflict between the calming effect of a green space like a park, but when it's in an urban area, it's then conflicting with the more aggressive sounds of an urban area, ambulance sirens, traffic, helicopters, you name it. So we could start to begin to help the psychiatrists understand what the difficulties were that the children were facing, and what they then do about that, they can then work on. The picture on the right was for, we built the supermarket for University of Reading. You may have seen recently, they've just released their report on sensory environments, and we built this supermarket according to the results of their research, so that they could see that autistic people inside a supermarket, what were they finding difficult? What did a supermarket look like to them? In terms of its lighting, in terms of the stacking on the shelves, in terms of the noise, the smell, and then what we might do to be able to change that into something which would work for autistic people, but we can take the supermarket operators to look at that and see how they can affect it. So these are just some small examples of how we can actually do things in that space the way we can control the environment so we can make it better for everybody in the longer term. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I was scribbling notes hurriedly down myself because it's one of those areas. I always think it's for me, the environment is so important for people not only to continue to use it, but also to want to continue to use it. And from a shopping retail perspective, they want people to stay there longer because they spend more money. But that's a slightly different issue. Anyway, I'll go on. And can I now introduce Fiona? Now, Fiona worked as a sales executive manager and successfully sold multi-million-pound software systems to the financial sector. But she became progressively disabled, and she made sure when taking clients to the latest cool restaurant or bar that venues had the appropriate accessibility and facilities, which I think might have been quite a challenge. So basically, realising this information was of use to other people with disabilities became the basis for the website Blue Badge Style, BBS, which is redefining disability with style, and provides information on a range of issues. Revenue is generated from the BBS galleries and consultancy. They display access as a journey on a venue's website and via the BBS app. They were awarded the EIB Social Innovation Award. People are really testing my language today, I can tell you. My husband thinks I have a problem speaking English. In 2017, BBS won a Spark Award from the Design Council to develop a range of stylish accessories for people who have their hands full, the first product being Drink, the universal glass holder. More recently, in 2022, BBS won recognition from the UN-approved Zero Project. Now, Fiona is a co-founder with Robin Shepherd of Bespoke Hotels of the Global Blue Badge Access Awards and Blue Badge Access Consulting, inspiring better design, celebrating exceptional venues, improving accessibility for all. In recognition of her work in improving accessibility in the built environment, she was awarded an honorary fellowship of RIBA. RIBA is the Royal Institute of British Architects in 2021, and she's also Vice Chair of the Institute of Hospitality EDIB Council. I will say, Fiona, as a kind of personal plea, my husband lost the use of his left arm and hand through cancer, 2003, 2004. Please, can we have milk cartons that people can open with one hand? If you can challenge that, that would really help me. Anyway, I shall leave you now in Fiona's hands.
Hi, lovely to meet everyone. I'm afraid I don't like milk, so I'm not going to go anywhere near that. It's all about freedom shared, something that people take for granted until they become disabled. We were all about empowering people to enjoy their lives. Next slide. And a lot of people say to me, why is, particularly venture capitalists that I've approached, why is style important? And if you look at these two pictures, I know which one, if I was a man, obviously, which one I'd rather be perceived as. It's the one on my left, which is the young guy sitting on a Vespa scooter, rather than the aged guy riding a mobility scooter. So style is important for both mental and physical health. It's not mutually exclusive. And we are demanding equal access, independence, and style for all. And that's what the Blue Badge Access Awards are all about. Next slide, please. The awards are known as the Blades because we have this image on the right of a person wearing a blade entering a door unhindered. And if I could just tell you a recent tale, I was going to tell one tale about myself in Portugal, but one arose yesterday, would you believe it, at the Savoy in London. I went there being told it had been totally refurbished from the Savoy I knew 10 years ago. And it's been refurbished, but it has largely ignored the needs of disabled people, primarily because I wanted to go to the American bar, which is up a huge flight of stairs. And the doorman said, well, that's okay, we've built in a lift. So they had a lift up to the American Bar, but then there were 3 steps down. Being a wheelchair user, I still haven't worked out how to be a Dalek going 3 steps down. So they then said, oh no, we can take you this other way. Then there's a big argument between 2 members of staff and myself about how wide my wheelchair was. And I said, well, I can tell you, it will get through a normal door. Anyway, they did find a way through. It was always through the kitchens, through the bin areas, into the American Bar. Now, that, I'm afraid, is still not acceptable. So as I say, there are still ridiculous ramps and ludicrous loos, and people still have to suffer the indignity of going via the rubbish bins into Michelin-star restaurants, or in one case being told, oh, we've got it. And again, this happened to me today. They said, oh, we've redone the restaurant to make it wider, but we haven't put in an accessible toilet, but you can go to the pub across the road. Now, this is in a Michelin-star restaurant. I expect better than that. You know, why should we have to go to the local chicken shop to go to the toilet? So the Blue Badge Access Awards were set up to, as we believe, that rewarding venues is far more effective than punishing them. The governments across Europe really don't have the policing to make sure that accessibility adheres to standards. So we are offering a carrot rather than a stick to get venues to change their attitudes. Next slide, please. So, and the mission is to make sure that the disabled guest in hospitality is treated as a VIP, and that people say at hotels, I want to be upgraded to an accessible room. We're looking for a thoughtful, innovative and design-led approach to accessibility. And we celebrate and thank and admire exceptional venues who do this, providing dignity, independence and inclusion for all. Next slide, please. Oh, this was a picture of me, sorry, previous slide. This was a picture of me in Madrid a few years ago, where I just received the Social Innovation Award, and to get out of the venue, I had to go through the bin area. Still happens today. Next slide, please. So the BBAs, what are we all about? This is from our ambassador. This is Michael Keynes, who's a, sorry, can you hear the sound? I can't hear it. This is our ambassador, Michael Keynes, who's a Michelin-star chef, and he actually has one arm. And he's saying more than anything else that hospitality by nature has to be hospitable, and that doesn't apply to everybody at the moment. Next slide, please.
Fiona, do you want me to play the video? It was I could hear the sound. I'm assuming other people could.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine if everybody can hear it. Yeah. Carry on.
But it's also asking people to go the extra mile and think about all of people's needs rather than just ticking boxes and saying, we've done the minimum. I really do think the awards are challenging design. It's also highlighting what is good practice and bad practice, and it's inspiring other people to think about how they might attract and design spaces in a different way that makes it more, you know, amenable and more attractive for all guests. I'm hugely excited about the 2023 awards. It's the first time I've been involved. I think it's a great cause. I'm looking forward to the event and seeing the innovation, creativity this year, seeing how we keep on developing and pushing the boundaries year after year from this point forward.
So next slide, please. So with the big award at the awards ceremony is the comical award known as Ludicrous Loos, or Ridiculous Ramps as well. And these are 3 examples here. On the left is a bar in Spain where the accessible toilet is surrounded by barrels of beer. I mean, I've been in a toilet where someone said, which is, I couldn't turn around in my wheelchair to get in because it was full of sparkling water bottles. And they said, oh, don't worry, by the end of the night, they'll all be drunk. And I thought, well, they won't be drunk by me because I'll be bursting to go to the toilet by then. Anyway, the middle one is one I came across in Austria, in Vienna. And again, the toilet, the accessible toilet is perfectly good, but it's surrounded by dirty linen. And the one on the right is in the UK, which number one doesn't have the right number of bars around it, but number two, out of sight, hides a dirty mop and bucket. Next slide, please. And again, more ludicrous loos. The most weird one is one where at sort of at the top there, you can see there's a folding bed that was in Luxembourg, and the one next to it was a toilet in Covent Garden in London, where they had a beautiful accessible toilet, but the builders or the architects hadn't talked to each other, and the architrave around the door was so thick you couldn't actually get a wheelchair through, and I have quite a slim wheelchair. Again, there's always a hidden step to get into an accessible toilet. Again, there's another one there that's just a large room that I was shown in a 5-star hotel. No grab rails, nothing, it was just a large room. And lastly, there was the inexplicable. I went into one accessible and was met by a drag artist changing. So it was quite funny, but, you know, please keep them for people who are disabled. Next slide, please. And then we also had a look at what we call ridiculous ramps. On the left is one in Sicily, sorry, in Sardinia, where they've made a really lovely ramp in quite a small village. And I thought, well, wow, they're really taking accessibility seriously. The only problem was when I got to the top of the ramp, I couldn't get past the speakers they placed there for their open air disco. The next one is one in Copenhagen. And again, they've built a ramp which has got like a 6-inch step to get on it. And the one at the bottom right is one, I think, from Sochi in Russia, where there's a tree in the middle of it. Quite bizarre. Next one, please. More ridiculous ramps. The top one on the left was in Dundee in Scotland, where either the access officer or the town planner or whatever, in order to get a reasonable ramp to this doorway, has built what became a skating park, a skateboard park. Absolutely ridiculous. You need to make things look better than that. Next slide, please. The final ludicrous loo was in 2023, where the winners were 45 Jermyn Street. Now, it looks like a perfectly good, accessible toilet, but there were 2 doors into it. And unbeknownst to one of our supporters, who is visually impaired, she was sitting on the toilet only to be greeted by a waiter coming through one of those doors and out the other door with a whole tray of food. And it was a shortcut from the kitchen. So they won in 2024. And the ridiculous ramp that won in 2024 was at the Quadrant in Southampton, where they previously had a perfectly serviceable decking style ramp that this guy could get up in his electric wheelchair. But instead, they've changed it into what they believe is a better ramp, but it's got over a 3-inch step to get up. and you cannot do that in an electric wheelchair. So, you know, look at these examples and please learn from them. It's all I can say. Now, not to be more positive, some of the toilets we have best toilet for have been really innovative. Number one, they look good, and number two, they have good visual contrast. They have all the right grab rails. One of them actually has buttons around the floor, which if you fall, you can press one of these buttons that's close enough to you, as opposed to having to deal with the red emergency cord, which is always tied up because it's always in the way. Again, some more good accessible toilets. The one in the top middle is from Hyde in London, and that was a beautiful toilet. Not only did it look lovely, it had a beautiful ceiling full of dried flowers, but it also had a beautiful smell, something that a lot of accessible toilets do not have because they're not cleaned on a regular basis, unfortunately. And again, you know, these toilets here, I would say, are really beautiful. They're like the rest of the place, the rest of the restaurant or the hotel. They're not left as a hospitalized white or grey or pale blue. And again, our winner in 2024 was a bathroom developed for someone who had very complex needs in a guest house. And they've put in absolutely every kind of aid in there, including a bath, so that people with complex needs can go to the toilet in absolute confidence that whatever their need is, they're going to be looked after. But secondly, that it looks gorgeous. It doesn't look that bad. It doesn't look like a hospital toilet. And just a little extra one here. We've got bewildering bathrooms. The top right there is of specific interest because I showed it to someone and they said that looks like the Marquis de Sade's bathroom. It looks like a torture chamber. And again, a lot of these other the other picture on the top left, I was shown that as an accessible bathroom, but there's not a grab rail in sight, and the sinks were way too high, and the toilet was way too low. Again, bottom left is a shower seat that was installed in a 5-star plus hotel where they'd taken the measurements incorrectly, and the shower seat was about 6 inches off the floor, so you couldn't use it. And again, bottom right there, they put a retracting grab rail right next to the wall. So they are retracting grab rails so that you can transfer, but you couldn't possibly transfer, there's no room there. And again, being more positive, there are plenty of examples of really thoughtful wet rooms. On the right, there is one from the Edition Hotel in London, and the lighting doesn't do it justice, I'm afraid. But again, unfortunately, the red cord doesn't reach the floor. But I can safely say that those grab bars kept me in position throughout my showering. And on the left there, I was trying to illustrate that a bathroom doesn't have to have the grab rails in it. One particular innovative approach has been to put the grab rails in on hinges that you can disguise when they're not being used. So you put the grab rail in when somebody wants to use the accessible bathroom and take them away if you want to give it to an able-bodied person. So you get maximum revenue from your hotel room. If you just play this one, this is an imaginative approach to putting a hoist in a bedroom at Hotel Brooklyn, where the hoist is hidden away. It looks like a normal bedroom, but it comes out of a cupboard electronically when you want to use it. Genius. The video. This was our winner of Best Hotel, and one of the reasons was because they put in this really beautiful set of stairs to make it accessible to everybody. You can play the video. Thank you. And that really sums up why we award Blue Badge Access Awards, because we hope it will encourage other companies to develop really innovative and thoughtful approaches to accessibility. Thank you.
Okay, that was really interesting, especially since I worked on that hotel, which I didn't know we should have won the award. So that's a whole new learning lesson for me. I just want to say there's a couple of things that I took from the talk before we move on to the questions. But really from David's talk, I think what I got from it is the fact that we have moved quite a way forward in terms of inclusion, and particularly in the UK, but we still have an awful long way to go. And I think that's true. And, you know, it'll never be enough. I think we just have to keep looking for it and keep looking for innovation. I think the element of sort of higher level policy, but not putting it into action, that can happen. There can be a disconnect between the policies and actions and then how it filters down. And yeah, I agree, one size doesn't fit all. And I really, as I said before, put a plea out that if you can share any research that comes out from inclusion, please share it, particularly with people like myself who sit on the British Standards BS 8300, for instance, because it's really important, because research really helps to formulate and change standards for the rest of the country. Now, yeah, Nick's talk, Pearl, what an amazing facility. Really, really, I need to come and visit it. So next time I'm in London, I would love to. I have heard about it before. And I do think this is about capabilities, because what I always say is that an environment either enables or disables a person from achieving their goal of being part of that environment. So that's what we need to really think about. And I love the bit about cultural diversity, but also climatic culture, really, how things change from day to day. I sit in my office and I've got a really high window. Sometimes I'm blinded by it and I have to start dipping down and something's not quite right about it. And very quickly with Fiona, I love the carrot and stick. We use it all the time. But I really think that, particularly with hospitality, why wouldn't they want everybody to be able to get into it? Not just them, but their friends and relatives. You know, that's the whole point of it. And I really love the awards, because there aren't enough awards around. And I think it's a great thing to have in. And one thing I did take from it, I mean, I loved all the ridiculous examples. I've got loads more. What we really need are some really good examples, because we need to learn. We need to learn by example. We need to show people that it can be done, that it can be beautiful. It doesn't have to be medical. And I think that's really, really important. So I'm going to have to sort of move on to questions, which I am going to have a little nosy at. Again, that's really following what I was talking about, that we need to get this research out. We need to get research into the places where we can actually help and use, and get that dealt with. Now then, let's have a look at another one. This is a good one, David. I think you might have a go at this one. Why did UK come up with the standards which are unwavering, but also not always appropriate, and allows projects to deliver to standards, but not to the needs of users? So I think what they're saying is that we have a standard, you have to stick to it. I just wonder what your thoughts might be on that one.
Well, the thing about the standards that we have, they are a moment in time, and they have been gradually improving over the years. I mean, way back the late 70s, for example, the British standard, you could have a toilet 1.4 by 1.6 square for a wheelchair user, almost impossible. And as time's moved on, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, right now in our standards, we do advocate for venues over 350 users. You can have changing places toilets which are 3 meters by 4 meters. But my point is that the minimum that you can put in is 1.5 by 2.2. And that's kind of evolved around indoor manual type wheelchair users, like your Vietnam War vet type of thing, rather than the larger chairs. So whereas the Equality Act would expect us to try and look at that and accommodate it, my point was being there is that the standard, and it's the same for a lot of host nation standards around the world, is that we're still in that moment in time, we're still moving forward. So we need to go forward. The point about involving users is we educate ourselves to understand that these standards are a minimum. So rather than, my point being, that rather than the minimum within law that you can put in, we should maximize that and go towards people. So in our defense, I'd say we are moving things on, but it has to get better. And the biggest change is going to be to get out of this kind of manual chair mindset and move into the bigger powered chairs, because they obviously take more space, and also it would depend on how the chairs are driven and move. If you have a small wheelbase chair with 2 small central wheels and it's a power chair, you can literally rotate on a sixpence. If it's a longer chair and the wheels are driven straight from the back and it steers from the bigger, you can have a huge turning circle. So I would say, yeah, we need to move on, but we need to do that all around the world. But we are moving on. And I just hope the next iteration of the building regulations will reflect that. But it was a really good point, really good point.
I think the interesting thing for me about standards is that if we didn't have them, it wouldn't happen at all. Because it is a way of getting developers to understand what it might mean.
Yeah.
And I do think we need to move on. And the ARUP did some research recently for the approved document T consultation that's out, which is showing bigger spaces. So we are moving on, and I think we need to keep moving on. I'm sorry, I don't want to take over the question. I could talk for England, so I'm going to try and take over the conversation. But one thing, there was a question asking about Europe, and I think there are international standards, there are European standards, but the British standard and the ENs are still cooperating. So ultimately, the BRIES ENs will be similar, but it is such a complex project, and there's quite a few people on here, I think, who probably are from Europe, and they probably know better than me. But there was something called Mandate 420. We are slightly different, but I would say that standards are really important for us to move forward. And I'm looking at the questions. Let's have a look at. I'm going to ask one that I've always wanted to ask, actually, and I think it might be relevant. What do you think is the most effective change the design industry can make to effect inclusive design?
Shall I grab that? I think it should resonate and go down well with the audience. It's the most effective change we can make is, as I was saying, put people at the heart. So we need to broaden the diversity of people working in the industry. And I've seen that happening over the years. I've seen it happen because I go back a bit. When I first started, there were very few women at the design table, very few. Now we see a lot more. And I tell you what, this has a huge impact. Because I tell you why, because women listen, because they've had to. Men don't have to listen. Don't have to, do we? And that's a huge difference. And the same now with disabled people is to bring them to there's more coming to the design table and also at high level. So for example, the Minister for Disabled People should be a disabled person. People heading up policies and government departments should be disabled people. People leading design teams on specific projects should be disabled people. And then imagine if you have a landscape architect who's visually impaired, that's you're going to get better designs. I know graphic designers who are colorblind, so they bring that to the table. I know Cundles have an acoustic engineer who has a hearing impairment. So bang, they just do it, and that's
David,
what we need.
I have to say, I'm not disabled.
Oh, I
However,
don't. Sorry. Yeah. I'm saying variety. We need
Variety.
more. We need
Yeah.
more diversity.
my husband is disabled, but I didn't get into this before he became disabled.
It's not wholly owned.
Yeah.
Access is for all, for everybody. Yeah.
Does anybody else like to join? Fiona, do you want to?
I just add one thing. What I found is when I've gone to different places is that the standards are great, but whether the designer or the architect or the builder, if they don't all talk to each other in the same language, it doesn't work. Because as I say, doorways are too narrow, or toilets are too low or too high or whatever. And that happens, and that they're not up to standard because you're all speaking different languages, as far as I can tell. I'm just the poor user.
I think one of the things I would point people to is the RIBA now has an inclusion overlay for the RIBA plan of work, which outlines what each of the design team members should do. And one of the things it recommends that each design team, M&E structures, has an inclusion champion who represents that on that project, which I think is what you're talking about, Fiona, is about we don't talk the same language. So if you have all of the design teams have an inclusion champion on them.
But the problem we have in the UK as well is we have this thing called reasonable adjustments. And what I find in hospitality in particular is they just use that as an excuse to not put things in place. They also use the historic building or grade 2 listing excuse. It's an old building. We're not allowed to change it, and that's complete nonsense because England have said the history of a building is your history as well as everybody else's, so they should be adapted.
I think you can find some really good examples for the Selwyn Goldsmith Awards. Historically, we generally have a historic building that's managed to achieve that. It isn't a get out of jail free card. That's the thing. It isn't. It has to be about what it should be. Sorry, I'm taking over again. So I'm looking at the questions. Jane Duncan had a couple. Yeah, I was asked if the BS 8300 has been updated in light of the ARIT research. Potentially, because BS 8300 is just about to be revisited again. So watch this space. Let's have a quick look. Okay, this is an interesting one. A lot of successful interventions shown in the last presentation look like they came at quite a cost. One of the intersections often ignored is class and accessibility, with money often being the biggest hurdle to innovative accessible design. How do we make accessibility across class groups? So we're talking here about, I think, the UK social kind of area. Anybody got any comments on that aspect?
I can kick off on that one, Jane. The first thing I would say is that the earlier that you think about accessibility in the process, the cheaper it's going to be. Yeah. And I think a lot of the issues, and of course, if you've got an old building, you're past the early stage of the design process. But I think a lot of the trouble is that the mentality is often, let's design the building or the facility or whatever it is, and then we'll think about the accessibility afterwards. Whereas if you started from the principle that everybody should be able to access this, whatever it is, this facility, and we build the facility around that principle, then your accessibility comes at almost no cost. And we found when we were building Pearl, I mean, it is, I mean, I would never say it's perfect because, one can always do better, but it's certainly the university's most accessible place. And that's because we started with the principle that that's what it had to be. And I don't believe that added cost. So I think there is so that's when you're building from scratch, you've got an advantage. And I think we need to think very much more around the concept that, nobody should be excluded from something. And if you start with that process, with that principle, then the other things will fit in, and you'll find that you can actually do it much more cheaply. When you've got existing buildings, you've got a much harder problem, of course. I totally accept that. I mean, the what used to be the Russell Hotel, I see it was got a new name now. That's a bit sad because it's lost a character there. But anyway, but that stair lift, whatever we want to, whatever it's actually called, I think is clearly was not the cheapest thing to do, but the intent that it shows is very valuable, and it's actually the positioning of that is very evident. People see that on the street. It's not tucked away in the back. That's actually in the main front access to that hotel. And I think that of itself is a really, really important statement about what the rest of the facility should be like. And I think there's a lot in there about when things are being thought about and how they're being thought about actually reduces the cost in the end.
I agree totally. I mean, you know, I remember working on an airport which remained nameless, and they wanted really good access. They said, we want exemplar access. When they realised what it would cost, they went, we want excellent access. So it's sort of tweaked slightly, but the principle was there that they wanted to make it really, really example. And I think the interesting thing for me as well is the cultural aspect, is the fact that we're dealing with worldwide access, and it varies from place to place by so much. I've got a question actually for you, Nick. How can we use Pearl for what can we do with your facility? Because you've got it, and why can't we use it to the full advantage?
Use it. That's what it's there for. So you can use it for testing options. You can use it for comparing all sorts of different things and with very complex things. So because we can change the sound and the lighting and the appearance and the smell, all of those sorts of things, we can create the kind of situation that you want and compare it with other things. So it enables you to explore a wider range of options much more cheaply than actually doing it. So I think one of its big values for the industry is, I mean, apart from all the research that we do, but that is a really valuable place where you can actually put in something, show it to people, get them to experience it, and then say, well, that didn't quite work. What happens if we do this? And I think that's where it can be really useful, and that's what it's there for. So just send me an email.
Can I add to that? The value of that, Nick, is it's user-centric. So it's not you're aware of standards, but to find out what really works for people is you need to work with people, and that's the beauty of what you're doing. Is you go straight to the heart of the matter.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to me, standards are kind of the last refuge of the incompetent. It's the excuse for not doing things, and everybody designs down to standards, not up from them.
But you find little bits of gold dust.
Yes.
When you do that.
Yeah, but if you put people in the middle, you put people in the center. This person, whatever the standards say, we need this person to be able to do that, and then you build for that rather than the standard.
I think there's a question I've got, well, I think I know the answer, but why does style matter, Fiona? I mean, I'm an architect by training, and people seem to think that inclusion is going to destroy the joy. So, why does style matter?
Well, everyone's got a sense of style, whether you realise it or not. And again, I said to another venture capitalist I was talking to, and he was saying, why does style matter? I said, well, you're wearing a blue cashmere jumper today with sort of chinos. Now, that is your style. You chose to do that. Now, style, when you're disabled, is quite often the one thing you can control when your body is not doing what it should be doing. And it aids mental well-being. If you feel good, if you look good, and you feel good, you'll do good.
Yeah.
End of story. Everyone's got a style. I don't necessarily agree with it in many cases, but everyone's got a sense of style.
I think there has been quite a lot of research on, and I think there's something that Jane Duncan put in the chat, that good environments lift your mood and your space. I worked on an SEN school a few years ago where they had a room that was supposed to put children to calm down, designed for one particular child, but because of the school and because it was so much better, they never used it. That child didn't need it anymore because the environment was just far, far better. So inclusivity is far more than just.
And the other thing that
dresses.
one of the other questions was, accessibility doesn't have to be expensive. I very often have to small restaurants, in a high street. They don't have ramps. It's in Richmond, for example, where they've got very steep steps and everything. I said, if you shared a ramp, it would only cost you about £50 each. Now that is cheap, and and also training of staff. Training of staff makes a big difference.
I think the really important thing from a design perspective is that access is on the agenda, and it needs to be on every agenda. And I think if that's one thing that we can get designers to do, is to think about it from the beginning, Nick, like you said, on every stage. What have we done on accessibility? I think that's really important. And I'm going to shut up now because I'm not supposed to be saying too much.
I'm just gonna, sorry, David, do you
I
parting
was
words
Yeah, point
in
out.
your stylish jacket?
Oh yeah, with my hanky. It was to say it's about money too, and so it's not all about losing money for a client. It's about making money. I was doing a job in London, worked several months, and being the guys, we found it's called the Meat House up from Euston, and they made a ramp out of planks. We must have spent about £400 a week there. And I'll tell you what, for a few planks, so they got their money's worth, didn't they? And the other thing to say is, I worked with Marks and Spencer's eons ago, and they put a power door in Northumberland Street on the High Street. And that was the first place the carpet wore out of all the doors, because they put one power door in and the carpet wore out because everyone was going in and out through that door. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank David and Jane and Nick and Fiona and our audience, and especially wanted to thank EQN and the Diversity 2020 project for this super interesting talk, and just thank you all for your contributions, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.